In a room thick with authority and arrogance, she stood motionless, her eyes steady, her breath calm. The command to remove her uniform wasn't just an order, it was a test. A cruel attempt to strip her of respect, to remind her that she was still seen as an outsider among the men who questioned her right to wear the same insignia. The air grew tense, and whispers slithered through the ranks like cold wind. Yet, she didn't flinch, she didn't beg or protest. Instead, she began to unbutton her jacket with the kind of composure that only comes from someone who has already faced storms far greater than humiliation. As the layers came off, the silence deepened. The commander's sharp gaze followed every move, expecting shame or hesitation, but finding neither. Her scars told their own stories, battles fought in silence, wounds healed without applause. And then, when the final layer revealed her shoulder, the atmosphere shifted. There it was, the tattoo, bold, carved deep into her flesh, weathered by time but alive with meaning. The mark was unmistakable, the insignia of a fallen elite unit, one whose members were presumed dead in an ambush years ago. The same unit the commander himself once served under. The commander's breath caught. His voice, once commanding, faltered. He stepped closer, the disbelief shadowing his features as memories of that operation flooded back. The dust, the fire, the loss. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone softer than anyone had ever heard it. She met his eyes, unwavering, and replied quietly, "It's not where I got it, sir. It's where I earned it." Those words carried the weight of every fallen comrade, every silent night she survived, every promise she made to never let their legacy fade. The soldiers who had been smirking moments ago now stood frozen, their pride shattered by the quiet power of revelation. The woman they tried to humiliate had walked through a battlefield none of them could comprehend. That tattoo was not rebellion. It was remembrance, a permanent tribute inked in honor, not vanity. In that instant, the meaning of valor changed for everyone present. It wasn't loud, it wasn't boastful, and it certainly wasn't male. It was silent, scarred, and strong enough to make even the most hardened men bow their heads. When she buttoned her uniform back up, the room stayed silent. No one dared to speak. The commander, still rooted in place, gave a small nod, not as a superior, but as a soldier paying respect. What began as an act meant to break her spirit became a moment that redefined leadership, courage, and respect. The mark on her skin wasn't just a tattoo, it was a story of resilience. Proof that true valor doesn't need a voice. It only needs the strength to stand tall when the world tries to tear you down. The order was meant to humiliate her, a public stripping of authority in front of 180 soldiers. The commander's voice was sharp, echoing through the barracks, meant to break her pride and remind her of her place. She didn't argue, she simply nodded and began to remove the uniform that had become both her shield and her burden. The soldiers who watched expected fear, embarrassment, maybe even tears. But what they saw instead was something unsettling, calm. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and precise, the movements of someone who had long stopped fearing judgment. As the fabric slipped from her shoulders, the murmur in the crowd died. The tattoo on her back caught the dim light, dark ink stretched across battle, hardened skin. It wasn't decorative or delicate. It was a soldier's mark. A winged insignia wrapped around a line of coordinates, numbers that only a few in that room recognized. The commander froze mid-breath. Those coordinates weren't random. They belonged to a war zone, a covert operation buried deep within classified files. The same mission that had cost him his closest men years ago. The same battlefield where legends were made and lost. He took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper now. "Where did you get that?" he asked, not as a superior, but as a man searching for ghosts. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze over her shoulder. "It was the day your men fell." "Sir," she said quietly. I was there. I carried one of them out. The weight of her words hit him harder than any explosion ever could. The tattoo wasn't just a symbol. It was a promise etched into her flesh, a memorial to the soldiers who never came home, a vow that their stories would never fade into history's silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room, filled with men who had once doubted her, now stood in reverent stillness. The arrogance that had fueled their laughter melted into awe. The tattoo that they thought would expose her weakness instead revealed her strength. It told a story of pain and loyalty, of a woman who had earned her place not through privilege or rank, but through blood, sweat, and loss. It was the language of sacrifice, one that needed no translation, no explanation. Every soldier in that room could feel it. Every scar on her body was a word in that unspoken story. When the commander finally broke the silence, it wasn't with an order, but with respect. He saluted her, slow, deliberate, sincere. The gesture rippled through the ranks until every soldier stood straight, their hands raised in silent acknowledgement. She didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't thank them. She simply lifted her uniform again, covering the mark that had spoken more than any speech ever could. The tattoo wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to remember. And on that day, it reminded them all that real honor doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. The air inside the training hall was heavy with tension. Every soldier stood in formation, eyes locked on the lone woman at the center. The order that had just been given echoed like a strike of thunder. Remove your uniform. It wasn't a standard command. It was humiliation disguised as discipline. The men around her shifted uncomfortably, some smirking, others averting their gaze. She didn't move for a moment, only exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but out of restraint. Her silence was unnerving. Then, with measured calm, she began to comply. Each movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though she were stripping away not dignity, but doubt. The soldiers expected shame, but what they saw was composure, the kind born from surviving what others couldn't even imagine. When the last layer fell away, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Across her back and shoulder was a tattoo, stark, bold, and undeniably military. The emblem was unmistakable, a black dagger cutting through angelic wings, surrounded by a ring of coordinates. It wasn't random ink, it was sacred. It belonged to a classified unit that no longer existed, a unit wiped out during a mission that the commander himself had led years ago. For the first time, his voice failed him. The arrogance in his posture dissolved into shock. He stepped forward slowly, eyes tracing the mark that brought back a flood of memories. The ambush, the explosions, the comrades he couldn't save. That insignia. He muttered, almost to himself. You were there." She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "I wasn't supposed to make it out, but someone had to bring them home." Her voice didn't tremble. It carried the weight of every fallen soldier's name, every night she had spent alone fighting to keep their memory alive. In that moment, the commander's authority faded. He wasn't standing before a subordinate anymore. He was standing before a survivor. The soldiers who had mocked her now couldn't meet her eyes. The silence that filled the hall was no longer tense, but reverent. It was the silence that falls when truth exposes ignorance. They had tried to strip her of her pride, but what she revealed instead was her soul, carved in ink, forged in fire. That tattoo wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. It told of loyalty that outlasted rank, of courage that didn't need permission. The men who had seen her as weak now understood that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands still and lets the truth speak for itself. The commander took one final step forward, his voice low and steady. "Soldier," he said, "put your uniform back on." But this time, his tone wasn't commanding. It was respectful. She obeyed quietly, buttoning her jacket with the same calm that had silenced the entire room. When she looked up again, every soldier stood at attention, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Respect had been born, not from rank or rule, but from revelation. What was meant to break her became the moment that bound them all in honor. Her silence had spoken, her scars had testified, and her tattoo, the mark of her past, had become the seal of her strength.